Live streaming. El live streaming de este.
¿Dónde está?
Yo acabo de compartir el link en Twitter.
Let's be punctual.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Kniss. He is an associate professor at the Department of Plant Science at the University of Wyoming and has been there for almost 10 years. He got his bachelor in agroecology from the University of Wyoming. He got his master's in agronomy from the University of Nebraska, and then he went back to the University of Wyoming to get his PhD degree in agronomy with a minor in statistics. And his research program focuses on developing sustainable weed management programs in agronomic crops, especially sugar beet, winter wheat, corn, and dry beans. And today he will be presenting us a talk about the impacts of GMOs on herbicide use and weed management in the U.S. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Kniss.
All right, thank you, Marlene. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about primarily about herbicide use is where I'm going to spend my time. Because of the way that we use herbicides in the U.S., especially in our primary crops, corn, soybean in particular, herbicide use gets tied up into GMOs and biotechnology because most of the GMOs out on the market are herbicide-resistant crops, and so they're fairly inseparable at this point in discussion. And so anytime I do talk about herbicides, I do, when I think it's important to kind of understand where my credentials and biases are from. Anytime you talk about a relatively controversial topic like pesticide use, herbicide use, GMOs, you can get wildly different opinions when they're looking at the same data. So I just want to kind of walk you quickly through kind of my credentials and biases. Marlene told you about some of my background. My primary job responsibility right now at the University of Wyoming is to teach and conduct research on crops, weeds, and herbicides. So most of my research program is actually focused more on crop-weed interactions and weed ecology side of the equation. But I do spend a fair amount of time incorporating herbicides into my research, doing basic herbicide screening. So herbicides are something that are a major part of my herbicide program, or my research program. Even if they're not the focus of a particular project, it probably involves use of herbicides within that research project. And so anytime I talk about pesticides and I say something good about any pesticide, one of the very first things I get asked is, well, how much is Monsanto paying you to do that? And I'll tell you, Monsanto has paid me nothing to do that specifically, but I do receive research funding from Monsanto and Bayer, which are now apparently going to be the same company, Dow, DuPont, a fair number of the big companies in the seed and chemical industry. I do collaborate with those industries. I think it's important as part of my job at a land-grant institution to know what's going on in industry and know about the technologies that growers that I'm trying to help use. And so I do collaborate with them, and that does result in support of my research and outreach program to some extent from the industry. I also receive funds from farmer groups. I receive funds from both state and federal agencies that are more in the public realm, competitive grants. So I receive actually most of my funding on the right side of this slide, where we're looking at the Department of Agriculture, the University of Wyoming Ag Experiment Station, and the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. And if you want to look at how that breaks down, the grower cooperatives are a fairly small slice of my research program. Industry money is somewhere in the order of about a fourth of the money that I brought in over the last 4 or 5 years to support my program. But public competitive grants remain a pretty major part of where I receive my funding. Okay, and we can talk about funding and how that biases people's thoughts and opinions all day. But I can tell you, if we want to talk about my biases and how I view the world, the fact that I grew up on a farm taints my views of things far more than I think any level of funding ever could. This is actually a photo of my dad and my grandpa. My dad won a 4-H sugar beet project when he was in high school. And growing up on the farm and trying to support family farmers is really far more biasing on my opinion. That's the lens through which I view the world, is trying to support family farms like, you know, those that my parents and my grandparents have worked on since they came here. And then finally, I'm just fairly recently became in charge of feeding this guy. I've got a 3-year-old at home. He's a lot of fun. Spaghetti night, as you might imagine, at the Kniss household is also bath night, regardless of what else is going on. I've learned a lot about food and nutrition just fairly recently, but I take it pretty seriously when I talk about pesticide safety, because it changed my world when you have a little child at home. And I, as part of my job, like I said, I use pesticides pretty regularly. Using personal protective equipment and making sure I'm not bringing that stuff home with me became a very different priority for me as soon as this one showed up. And actually, even more recently, 5 weeks ago, in fact, this one decided to join our world. My wife's in charge of feeding him for the first little while, especially this week since I'm gone. But yeah, so this also really tends to bias my views, again, probably far more than research funding does. Okay, so getting into the actual topic at hand here, herbicide-resistant crops. When we talk about herbicide-resistant crops, most people think of GMOs and Roundup Ready, but it's important to recognize that herbicide-resistant crops existed before GMOs, before biotechnology. We actually have several types of conventionally bred herbicide-resistant crops, and so usually derived through chemical mutagenesis or bringing in genes from wild relatives. The imidazolone herbicides, there's been crops bred to be sprayed with those. Sulfonylurea herbicides. We actually even had some canola varieties that were bred to be resistant to the triazine herbicides like atrazine. So it's not like GMOs was a completely new method of weed control. We've been doing similar things for a fairly long time. But in the GMO world, we have two that are fairly high profile that are commonly used today, the glufosinate-resistant crops. You may hear them referred to as Liberty Link. But far and away, the most common, the most well-known, the most important from an economic standpoint are the glyphosate-resistant crops or the Roundup Ready crops that are generated to allow the use of glyphosate herbicide or Roundup herbicide, as it's more commonly called. So that's really what we're going to focus on most of today is the glyphosate part of this equation. Okay, and the reason is if you look at worldwide adoption of biotech crops, this is a figure from the ISAAA.org. Soybean, corn, cotton, canola account for a vast majority of the worldwide acres planted to biotech crops. And of those, herbicide tolerance is actually a pretty major chunk. So 53% of this whole pie is actually just herbicide tolerant. That's primarily soybean and a little bit of the corn and a little bit of the cotton. But the stacked traits actually have both herbicide resistance as well as insect resistance. And so if you combine those, all the traits that have herbicide resistance actually account for almost 90% of worldwide acreage of biotech crops are resistant to herbicides, and a vast majority of that are resistant to glyphosate herbicide. Okay, so that's a major impact. Okay, so a lot of times when I talk to people, especially folks who are relatively friendly to GMOs, they talk about the antis. People who disagree with GMOs, that are ideologically opposed to biotechnology and want to have nothing to do with it. They don't want it in the system at all. And there's certainly a very vocal group of people who are opposed to any type of plant biotechnology or animal biotechnology. But when it comes to herbicide-resistant crops in particular, I think it's important to recognize that there's actually a fair number of people, very smart, thoughtful, nuanced people, who are very supportive of biotechnology and crops and GMOs in general, who still don't actually like the idea of herbicide-resistant crops. This is just an excerpt from a science blog from a very well-respected science blogger, someone whose opinion I very much respect and who I think is a very sharp individual. And she had to say, herbicide-resistant crops are perfect examples of how GM technology can be used poorly. And this last sentence, I think, is really the most important. How anyone could have thought that making a crop resistant to a herbicide was a good idea is beyond me. That's a pretty powerful statement from a very smart individual that I can't imagine why anyone thought that was a good idea. And yet hundreds and hundreds of millions of acres of crops are planted with this herbicide resistance trait. So hundreds of millions of people thought that was a good idea. So why is that? I'll tell you, it's not because farmers are stupid and they've been duped by Monsanto. Farmers, it turns out, have to manage weeds. Okay? And they want the best tools and the best technology to do that. A former president of the Weed Science Society of America once said, "More energy is expended for the weeding of man's crops than for any other single human endeavor." And I have absolutely no idea if that's true, and we probably would never know because that'd be a really difficult thing to actually find data to support. But if you consider, especially in the developing world, but even in developed countries, the amount of time and effort farmers spend on hand weeding crops or mechanically weeding crops or spraying herbicides, and you consider, especially over the history of time, how many people were involved in agriculture, I think it's a pretty plausible idea that this actually is a task, a pretty horrible, miserable task, that a huge number of hours and people's time has been spent with. Okay, so we can't forget that. It's really important to recognize this is something that farmers have to deal with. And along those lines, it's also important to remember, as we talk for the rest of today, that everything in agriculture is a trade-off. Okay, farmers are not just deciding to go spray herbicides, and glyphosate in particular, because it's a fun thing to do, right? They're doing that because they need to manage those weeds, or they're going to lose a substantial amount of crop yield. Okay? Now, they could spray glyphosate, or if they don't spray glyphosate, they have to do something else. They can spend time hand weeding. They can send their kids and their family out hand weeding. They can spray a different herbicide. They can run tillage implements. So, you know, the decision to use glyphosate and herbicide-resistant crops is not made in a vacuum. And so I think that's really important to consider. So one of the options is to just do nothing, right? To plant your crops and not manage weeds. And there's a really cool paper in 2006 called The Crop Losses Due to Pests, where he actually estimated how much potential crop yield is lost every year due to plant pathogens, due to insect pests, due to weeds, due to animal pests. And if you look at the potential yield loss due to weeds of the 6 major world crops, it ranged anywhere from 23% up to 40%, depending on the crop that was being planted. And these are worldwide estimates, so that's not uniformly distributed around the world. Food insecure regions of the world probably have higher numbers, whereas developed world tends to have a little bit lower numbers. So, you know, that's not uniformly distributed. And my guess is those estimates are probably even a little bit low. The Weed Science Society of America Weed Loss Committee recently came out with an analysis using real data from experiments conducted over the last several years that shows that for maize and soybean, it was actually around 50%. So these numbers might actually be a little bit low. So the interesting thing to me is that even with all of the technologies we have to manage weeds, all of the practices that we have available at our disposal, we're still losing about 10% of crop yields to weed competition on a worldwide basis. And again, that's not uniformly distributed around the world either. So managing weeds is a critically important thing for both farmers' viability, and also food security. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Another misconception that I often hear when we talk about herbicide use as it relates to GMO crops is that because we have herbicide-resistant GMOs, that if it's not a herbicide-resistant crop, that farmers don't spray herbicides on it. And that's simply not true. We've been using herbicides on these crops for a very long time. If you look at the three big ones, corn, soybean, and cotton, that we have GMO versions of those crops for herbicide resistance. In the years before we had glyphosate-resistant crops, 96% of the U.S. acreage of those three crops was treated with herbicides. After the application or the introduction of GMO crops, 96% of those crops were sprayed with herbicides in the U.S. So it's not like we changed from not using herbicides to using herbicides. We simply changed from using what we used to spray to different chemistries now. Okay, so that's another really critical thing. All crops out there in the world are resistant or tolerant to some types of herbicide. There's really no crop that I can think of that there isn't at least one or two herbicides registered for use to manage weeds in that crop. It'd be pretty unlikely to find crops that are not tolerant to some herbicides. Okay, so then this brings up the question that we'll probably spend the rest of today looking at. So we know that, even if the number of acres didn't change in what was sprayed with herbicides before and after GMO crop adoption, we know that herbicide use changed, right? Because we've engineered these crops to be resistant to the herbicide glyphosate. So obviously now we're spraying glyphosate on crops that we couldn't before. So we know there was a change in herbicide use patterns. We're increasing the use of glyphosate, to some extent probably decreasing the use of other herbicides, although I'll show you some data that second part of the equation may not be really all that true. This is the question that I get asked all the time. Well, was that change good or was it bad? And there's lots of publications out there that try to answer this question. I personally think they do a very poor job of it because they use some pretty flawed metrics. In particular, a lot of publications will just report, well, how much pesticide is being sprayed? Well, the amount of herbicide being sprayed to an acre is a pretty poor indicator of whether that's good or bad. I mean, I can give you 1 ounce of, say, marijuana and 1 ounce of arsenic, and I bet I know what most of you are going to choose among those drugs that I could potentially give you, right? So, toxicity is not the same between different compounds. So it's really important to think about that when we talk about changes in herbicide use. Even if herbicide use goes up, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. And if herbicide use goes down, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing because we may have switched to more toxic herbicides over time. Okay, so just looking at the amount. So I'm not even going to show you amounts today. I'm going to show you some different things. And here's another thing that confounds this analysis of was the change in herbicides good or bad. Anytime I get asked this question, was it good or bad? Was it beneficial or was it a detriment? I typically say, yeah, it was. It was good and it was bad. And it depends a lot on a lot of things, really. So this is actually a slide from one of my students, Carl Coburn, at the University of Wyoming from his master's thesis. Basically, what he looked at was this question of, was the change in herbicide use in Roundup Ready sugar beet good or bad compared to what we were using before Roundup Ready sugar beet? So we went through the literature and found studies that made this direct comparison, looked at rates, looked at yields, looked at all of the information that he could find, and then looked at how that related to mammalian toxicity, honeybee toxicity, groundwater risk, fish, bird, and aquatic invertebrates. And the way you interpret these figures is anything to the left of this dotted line on this slide means that the conventional herbicide programs we were using before Roundup Ready are better. Anything to the right means once we switch to glyphosate resistance using GMO varieties, the glyphosate system was better. Okay? And you'll notice it's not uniformly on one side or the other. The top panel is glyphosate compared to what we call the micro-rate herbicide program. That was a really common herbicide program used in sugar beet in the Red River Valley of North Dakota and Minnesota. And if you look at what they were doing, which is fairly low rates of these same herbicides that are used in this one, in terms of mammalian toxicity, honeybee risk, and birds, the old system was probably actually a little bit better, to be honest. If you really want to split hairs and talk about which one is better for the environment in a big picture sort of way. But if you look at groundwater risk, or if you're a fish or an aquatic invertebrate, the new system is better. Okay, but not all growers use that same conventional herbicide program. If you go to, say, where I live, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, the western region for sugar beet growing, there, mammalian risk was basically the same, not statistically different between the before and after adoption of Roundup Ready system. But for bees, groundwater, fish, bird, aquatic invertebrate risk, now the glyphosate-resistant system was uniformly better. So we didn't really see a huge difference in, say, applicator risk, but it improved almost all of the other characteristics of the environmental profile of herbicide use in those crops. So it's a really complex question, and it can't be boiled down to a single number or a single answer when you ask, is herbicide use better or worse than it used to be? Yes, it's different. Some aspects are probably going to be better, some aspects are probably going to be worse. So it depends a lot on what it is you're trying to ask. Okay, and I'm going to paraphrase H.L. Mencken here. For every question, there is an answer that is simple, neat, and wrong. It turns out almost nothing in agriculture is black and white, right? That is particularly true with most pesticide use. So when we're asking are herbicide changes over time, especially those in response to GMO crops, are those changes good or bad? It depends on what crop you're talking about, because not all crops are grown the same, obviously. It depends on which herbicides are being used in that particular crop. As I showed you earlier, it depends on the region because of which herbicides are commonly used in there. It may be different depending on where you're at in the US or around the world. And this is a big one that I think also gets dropped out. It depends on your values. You know, based on that last chart I showed, if you're in North Dakota, whether you saw that change in herbicide use as good or bad is going to vary pretty dramatically if you're a fish or if you're a bird, right? So which of those two organisms do you value most? That's a hard question to answer, right? We want to value all of everything equally, right? Well, it turns out because everything in agriculture is a trade-off, that's a really difficult thing to do. So if we want to know if something is good or bad, we really need to get in the habit of asking very specific questions that allow us to answer those very specific questions with good, solid data. So that's what I've tried to do, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time doing. So with respect to crop, I pulled the USDA herbicide use data for 6 different crops. And this is another thing that I think is important to realize. If you look at corn, soybean, and cotton, which a lot of publications have done previously, you can see trends over time in those 3 crops. And we tend to attribute a lot of those trends after adoption of GMOs to the adoption of GMOs. But it's really difficult to actually make that comparison because with USDA data anyway, they don't separate their data in what was applied to a GMO crop and what was applied to a conventional crop. So we can see the trends over time, and we can infer a fair amount about, you know, how much of that difference is attributable to the adoption of the glyphosate-resistant crops. But it's really hard to make a sound conclusion that, yes, that's completely due to this crop. So what I decided to do is actually throw in a couple of crops that don't have GMO alternatives. So I chose rice and wheat. So there are no herbicide or GMO herbicide-resistant varieties of either rice or wheat. And I use that as kind of the control group. So are the trends that we see in corn, soybean, and cotton very different than what we see in other crops that are not biotech? Or do we see basically the same trends across all 5 crops? And so is it just kind of a general trend that US farmers are doing rather than one that's very specific to the GMO crop? So that's why I chose to throw those 2 crops on. For herbicides, I looked at all of them. So if you pull the USDA data, I actually got all of the herbicide use data. So I think there were 119 total herbicides that were used in some way, shape, or form over the last 25 years in those 5 crops. The region, because it's USDA data, I was limited to the United States, so these trends don't necessarily hold for other regions that are growing biotech crops, particularly South America. I would imagine the soybean data may look fairly similar in areas where they're growing glyphosate-resistant soybean, but I'm not willing to make that statement on any kind of a firm basis just because this is USDA data. Okay, values. What am I actually looking at? So I chose two aspects of the wider risk assessment thing, because I mean you could spend all day asking is it good or bad for this species and this species and this species. So as a weed scientist, I'm particularly interested in the evolution of herbicide resistant weeds, and so that's one aspect that I looked at. So are the changes in herbicides more or less likely to select for herbicide resistant weed biotypes, what some of you might lovingly refer to as superweeds? I'll try to avoid using that term, but if it slips out superweeds, I mean herbicide-resistant weeds. I'm not specifically talking about glyphosate-resistant weeds when I say that. I'm talking about all herbicides, so resistant to any particular herbicide. Okay, and then mammalian toxicity. So as someone who deals with herbicides on a regular basis as part of my job, and who works with farmers and pesticide applicators, that's probably the other thing that, you know, in terms of have things gotten better or worse, that's kind of another major value that I have, because I mean, if we're making things more toxic over time, that's a bad trend, right? We want to avoid that. And so that's the other aspect that I wanted to look at, because I care about the people that I work for who are the growers, but also some personal investment there because I use these same herbicides on a regular basis. So I looked at both acute and chronic toxicity from a mammalian perspective. Okay, so the data I used was USDA data, which is freely available. Anyone can go to quickstats.usda.com or quickstats.nas.com or .gov and download this data. So I looked at the period 1990 to 2015. I'd have gone back further, except the database basically starts in 1990 for these herbicide and pesticide use surveys. And there were 119 different active ingredients that were part of that database. So the toxicity data then I looked up for each of these 119 herbicides. I looked up the acute rat toxicity in terms of the LD50. So the LD50 is a pretty standardized method of figuring out acute toxicity. So how many laboratory rats can you kill at a given dose? Okay, so it's the dose that kills 50% of that test population. So the thing to keep in mind for both the acute and chronic toxicity data is that high numbers mean less toxic, okay? So low numbers mean more toxic. So if it only takes 1 gram to kill you versus 100 grams to kill you, give me the 100-gram version, right? So low numbers mean more toxic. That's the same with chronic rat toxicity. For that, I looked at the 24-month NOEL, which stands for No Observable Effects Level. So there's a little bit of a caveat that I'll point out for the NOEL. LD50, although it's certainly an imperfect measure of acute toxicity, I think it's fairly standardized and fairly repeatable over time. The NOEL depends a little bit more, I think, on how the experiment is set up. And I'll show you an example. And so when you look at the chronic toxicity data that I'm going to show, be sure to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt for the reasons I'll show. So I got all these figures from the herbicide handbook. And where I couldn't find it in the herbicide handbook, I looked up the EPA registration documents to find these toxicity measures. Okay, so what I did with that toxicity and amount data, so I took the herbicide applied for each active ingredient in each crop in each year, divided that by the number of acres that were surveyed to get that data. So that then gives us the amount of herbicide applied per acre. So it basically standardizes it to a per acre because the corn acres change from year to year, right? So if you just look at the herbicide applied, that gives you a really diluted view of things. If you have 50 million acres in one year and 80 million acres in another, you're going to have a hell of a lot more herbicide applied when you have a hell of a lot more acres. So that standardized that. So that gives us the amount of herbicide applied per acre. And then divided that by the toxicity factors. So the amount per acre divided by the LD50 to get the acute. And what I'm going to call this is toxicity load. I'm not a toxicologist by training, so there's probably some folks that will criticize my use of terminology, but that's what I'm going to call it. Basically, that allows us to get the amount per acre divided by the LD50. That gives us basically a measure of overall toxicity of all the herbicides that are being applied. So it's basically the number of LD50s that are being applied. So Standardizing it in this toxicity load gives us a little bit more intuitive way of looking at the data than looking directly at these figures, because now for the toxicity load information, high numbers mean more toxic. Okay, so if you have a high toxicity load, that means it's probably worse off from mammalian toxicity standpoint. Okay, so now I want to just give you that little caveat about the NOEL. If a harmful dose of any given herbicide, let's say it's 45 milligrams per kilogram in your diet, eaten every day for 2 years. If you set up a study like this, where you feed these animals 1, 10, 25, 50, and 100 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, your NOEL in this study, if the actual harmful dose is 45, you won't see any harm to those animals at 25 grams, but you would see some harm at 50. And so in this study, if you set it up like that, your NOEL would be the highest dose where you didn't see a problem. So that means your NOEL would be 25. Now for this exact same herbicide, if you set up your study a little bit different when you're doing your EPA registration, and you have 1 gram, 50 grams, and 100 grams, even though the harmful dose may still be 45, you observed harm at 50, but the highest dose for which you did not see a problem now is only 1 gram. Which means for the same herbicide, depending on how you set it up, if you don't set it up well to begin with, you can actually get a fairly large difference in that chronic NOEL number just on the way you set up the study. So that's why I say make sure you interpret the chronic data that I'm showing you with a little bit of caution, just because there are some weirdness that shows up in some of these NOEL figures. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip past that one because I think it's fairly clear. So the other thing I did is looking at herbicide diversity. Okay, so when we talk about the evolution of superweeds or herbicide-resistant weeds, that generally is tied to a lack of herbicide diversity. Okay, if you apply the same herbicide to the same area of land over and over and over again, that's when you develop resistance to that herbicide. Okay, so if you use one herbicide 1 year and you don't use it again for 6 years, or you always use it with another effective herbicide, the selection pressure for herbicide-resistant weeds is much lower over time. So you can actually quantify that. There's a really interesting story that I won't tell today about Shannon's entropy or Shannon's diversity index, really commonly used in ecology. But the origin of this number actually derives from information and cryptology research, which is fascinating. But basically what this tells us is it's a number that we can standardize into a metric that I'm going to call the effective number of herbicides. And I'm happy to chat with you afterwards about how that's done. But basically the effective number of herbicides gives us an estimate of herbicide diversity. So a high number for effective number of herbicides means high diversity. That means there tends to be more herbicide modes of action used per acre, which when we talk about resistance development, high diversity means fewer superweeds. Okay? And there's lots of caveats to that, but in general, on a large scale, this pattern should hold true. Okay? So more diversity is a good thing if we're really worried about the evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds. Okay, so one more caveat before we dig into some data. Again, the USDA data does not segregate GMO versus non-GMO. So what we're looking at is trends over time, some of which will be very obvious that we can attribute to the adoption of glyphosate resistance, because glyphosate starts showing up as a major contributor into the herbicide programs. But it's not a direct thing. So the question we're going to be asking is only kind of indirectly related to the question of GMOs, is has toxicity applied to the crops we're looking at, has it increased or decreased over time? And then does herbicide diversity, has it increased or decreased over time? So now we're talking very specific questions that we can answer with, I think, pretty solid data from the USDA. Okay, so the rest of the time I'm going to be spending on results. So the next set of slides are all going to look fairly similar. There are lots of colors. The one I really want you to zero in on is this kind of beige one that'll show up in the middle of most of the figures. That beige brownish one kind of in the middle is group 9 herbicides, EPSPS. That is glyphosate. It is the only herbicide with that mode of action. So all of these beige bands will be the glyphosate. All of the rest of them are different types of herbicides. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to the figures on the left of this series of figures. So this is for corn. And if you look at panel A in the subsequent figures, if you look at the y-axis, it's the number of herbicide treatments per acre. So it's not necessarily the number of times a grower went out and sprayed, but it's the number on average of active ingredients or of herbicide modes of action being applied to a given acre over time. So in 1990, on average in corn, there were about 2 herbicide modes of action being applied per acre across the U.S. Now, we're actually looking at about 3.5. So we actually have increased the number of herbicide sites of action being applied per acre in corn. So how does that relate then to diversity? So the diversity is, again, this is the effective number of herbicides. It actually has increased up until about 2002 and then more or less plateaued. It just kind of stopped going up. Now, if you look closely at what happens with the glyphosate in this figure, we don't actually see glyphosate becoming a major player in the corn market until after 2002. So actually the increase in herbicide diversity in corn in the United States tends to plateau right at the time when glyphosate enters that market. So almost all of this increase in herbicide diversity, which would mean a decrease in potential selection pressure for super weeds, you know, those trends for increase basically stop when glyphosate enters the market. Okay, for soybean, the glyphosate chunk is a much bigger band in this one. So again, that middle kind of brownish beige band really eats up a lot of that market share and starts a lot earlier. So well before 2000, we're seeing a huge increase in glyphosate use. Overall, though, we see a little bit different trends. So we were on a pretty strong trend for increasing the number of modes of action applied in soybean. As soon as glyphosate enters the market, that drops. But then over the last decade or so, we've seen that increase again. Now, there's some folks who want to blame that on glyphosate-resistant weeds. I can't say that from this data. It seems at least somewhat plausible that that's what's driving this increase again. But if you look at the herbicide diversity or the selection pressure for glyphosate-resistant weeds, again, we were pretty stable. Glyphosate enters the market, herbicide diversity plummets, and then starts to go back up over the last decade or so, okay, because we're now using a few more herbicide modes of action in soybean. Cotton, the last of the 3 glyphosate-resistant crops, we see the same trend for increased modes of action being applied per acre. And glyphosate, again, similar to soybean, we see a huge increase. You know, about half of herbicide use in cotton when it comes to just herbicide site of action applications is resulting from glyphosate. And almost the exact trend as soybean, where we see herbicide diversity was increasing up until glyphosate and Roundup Ready entered the market. It drops, and then we've seen an uptick back up over the last decade or so. Okay, so what about the non-Roundup Ready crops? So for wheat, we see almost the exact same pattern. The other interesting thing is this is glyphosate again. Now, glyphosate can't be sprayed in crop in wheat or you'll kill it. So this glyphosate is actually probably mostly being sprayed for, say, people who have adopted no-till practices and are burning down before they plant, or they're spraying post-harvest, or they're spraying at the time of harvest. So these applications aren't for weed control, but we still see at least some level of glyphosate entering the wheat market. So it's quite plausible that some of these giant increases in glyphosate in some of our other crops aren't actually strictly due to the GMO trait. It's actually due to other uses of glyphosate. Because the other thing that this data doesn't show is that the cost of glyphosate has decreased over time. So growers are more interested in using it for some of those non-crop type applications. Okay, in wheat, we've seen a pretty constant increase in herbicide diversity, but if you remember the numbers on the y-axis, our effective number of herbicides for cotton was in the range of 6 to 8 most of the time. In wheat, it's still pretty low. We haven't even reached 5 yet for the wheat. So overall herbicide diversity in wheat is quite a bit lower, even though it's been on a trend for increasing over time. And then finally, rice. Rice has the fewest data points in the data set, but I still think it's worthwhile to look at because they're kind of clustered at the beginning and toward the end. We see the exact same increase in the number of herbicide modes of action being used, and that I think is a really critical point. So in all 5 crops that we've looked at, herbicide use in terms of the number of modes of action being applied per acre is increasing. So I think it's pretty safe to say that's not a trend that has been driven by GMO adoption. I think that's a trend that seems to be occurring all over U.S. agriculture and not specifically related to adoption of GMOs. We're seeing that increase. How does that relate to diversity? As actually fair, and that's a really terrible line, but with only 6 data points, there's only so much smoothing you can do. But basically it was low to start. Over the last decade or so, it's a fair amount higher. And that's because of new herbicide registrations. And to some extent, that was increased by this, this purple. You see, that's where the big increase was there. That's a conventionally bred herbicide-resistant crop. So they actually have ALS-resistant rice varieties. Okay, to summarize herbicide diversity, cotton and soybean herbicide diversity decreased, then increased after we adopted GMOs. Corn herbicide increased and then plateaued when we started incorporating GMOs. And diversity increase was a function of increased herbicide applications per acre. So the diversity is mostly coming because we're putting more modes of action on each acre, which, if you're really just interested in superweeds and not the environmental repercussions of herbicide use, in theory that's a good thing. And that's one of the reasons why I think the focus on superweeds as an environmental problem in and of itself is a little bit misguided. Because the best way to prevent herbicide-resistant weeds from occurring is to use way more herbicides and different herbicides. I think that's probably a bad idea. So I think we really need to kind of maintain focus on the environmental aspects of pesticide use. Superweeds are one fairly small driver that can alter that over time. Okay, and the other thing to keep in mind is that wheat and rice showed fairly similar trends without the dip. So we actually saw increased herbicide use and increased herbicide diversity in those crops as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at toxicity. And so the first set of slides for each crop is the chronic toxicity. The second one is going to be the acute toxicity. So the chronic ones, again, interpret those with caution. So this is chronic toxicity. Each color represents a different herbicide used in that crop. So basically a high number means, so on the left side, the scale and the numbers themselves are mostly meaningless, again, because it's LD50s or no wells per acre. That doesn't have a lot of meaning. But what we can do is compare how that has changed over time, and then which herbicides are driving those changes. So if you look at corn, chronic toxicity, we're actually higher now than we were before we had glyphosate-resistant crops. Interestingly, though, if you look at the herbicides that are driving that, it's not glyphosate. So it's actually the introduction of other herbicides or continued use of other herbicides in the corn market at increased rates that's driving a fairly, I think, subtle increase in chronic toxicity over time in the corn herbicide market. So again, it's kind of counterintuitive. We're seeing a huge increase in glyphosate use, but glyphosate use isn't actually explaining the increase in chronic toxicity. In fact, if you look at the top 20 herbicides, glyphosate didn't even make it in the list. Glyphosate is bulked into this other category that you can hardly even see. Okay, so when it comes to acute toxicity, though, well, now it's a completely different story. Now we've got a huge reduction in the acute toxicity of the herbicides that we're using in the corn crop. But again, it's pretty hard to make a case this is a huge reason, or that glyphosate and GMO use was a huge reason for this decline, because most of it is due to reduction in cyanazine, which was taken off the market because it's a relatively not great herbicide. And the other bit of change is the reduction in allichlor, which also was removed by the EPA really unrelated to glyphosate adoption. So if you take those two herbicides out of the market, you've got a pretty stable trend in acute toxicity. So we have seen a huge reduction in acute toxicity in herbicide programs in corn. Pretty tough to make a case that's due to glyphosate use in GMO crops, however. Okay, soybean. See, again, a huge decrease, but most of that is related to linearon reduction. That one may be a little bit related to glyphosate, but not nearly as much, because most of that had already come down before the introduction of glyphosate resistance. So that's for chronic toxicity. Acute toxicity also is decreased, but again, most of that is due to the removal of allachlor. So hard to make a case that that was purely due to glyphosate and GMOs. Cotton. Cotton has actually gone up. And most of that is due to use of a herbicide that, again, is not related to GMOs. So glyphosate, if you look on this one, glyphosate is also not in the 20 herbicides contributing to the chronic toxicity of our cotton herbicide programs. This other category is where glyphosate fits, and you can hardly even see it on the figure. So the reduction in acute toxicity has been a pretty consistent feature, but again, mostly due to reduction in herbicides that are not related to GMOs, and most of that reduction came before we had huge use of glyphosate in those crops. Wheat, where we don't have GMOs, again, kind of support the idea that maybe the changes we've seen are not a hugely related to GMOs. We've seen a pretty drastic reduction in chronic toxicity, but again, most of that is due to reduction in use of herbicides that have nothing to do with glyphosate. The acute toxicity, same thing, reduction. Rice, huge reduction, but again, it can't be due to GMOs because there's no GMO rice. Maybe due to herbicide resistance on the conventional side with the ALS resistance. And a reduction in acute toxicity in rice also, but again, not GMO related. Okay, so to summarize the toxicity data, acute toxicity has decreased in all crops, whether they're GMO or not. It doesn't seem to be hugely driven by adoption of GMO crops, even though we have seen a reduction in acute toxicity. Chronic toxicity has mostly decreased, with the exception of corn, which remained fairly stable to increased a little bit, and cotton, which seemed to increase, but almost purely driven by the use of a single chemistry. So again, it's probably not due to glyphosate. And I actually created a couple figures just to really drive that point home. This is the chronic toxicity in corn. All of this blue area are all of the other herbicides that are not glyphosate. And then the red is due to glyphosate. Red is on that figure. But actually at the resolution I had to make this figure so it would actually project on the screen, the resolution is low enough you can't even see the red sliver of line at the bottom. So glyphosate just really, because it has such a low chronic toxicity, it doesn't even register when we look at corn toxicity. The exact same thing when we look at cotton. Here, due to some of the artifacts of the figure, you can actually see that little tiny red line. Yeah, that's glyphosate. So yeah, the increase in toxicity that we are seeing in some crops basically is due to herbicides that have nothing to do with the GMO trait. Okay, so what does all this mean? Hell, I don't know. You guys are probably as good at figuring this out as I am at this point. But in a nutshell, cotton and soybean, we did see a reduction in herbicide diversity with the introduction of GMO crops. And that does probably relate to the introduction of glyphosate, because we saw a huge reduction in other herbicides being used at that time, which reduced herbicide diversity. So that probably related to the increased selection for glyphosate-resistant weeds. It potentially also increased selection for other herbicide-resistant weeds, because a reduction in diversity is not unique to just a single chemistry used in those crops. Okay, the toxicity of herbicide use has generally decreased in response to GMO crops. And even in the cases where we saw a stable trend or increasing trend, it was unrelated to the GMO part of the equation. So if anything, had we not had GMO, the chronic toxicity may have actually increased even more since glyphosate is 50 to 70% of the herbicide used in those crops, but still registers not at all on chronic toxicity, I think you could make an argument that the chronic toxicity would have even been worse if we did not have glyphosate, because we'd be having to use something that isn't glyphosate in those systems. Okay, so ending on this question, was the change good or bad? I guess I'm going to say once again, yes. It was probably to some extent good, to some extent bad, but to be honest, the GMO part of the equation when it comes to herbicide use probably has played a pretty minimal role in the overall changes in toxicity, and if anything has probably increased a little bit of selection pressure for the herbicide-resistant weeds. So that's probably the bottom line of where I see this data. You're welcome to disagree, because again, we can all look at the same data and probably come to different conclusions, but with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and there's my blog and my Twitter if you want to ask me questions later. So thank you very much. Yes?
I'd like to come back to a point you made right at the end, but you really glossed over it. And this is, if glyphosate was removed from the market, what would happen to your toxicity? You said, oh, it might change, but surely you could take all the other herbicides that are used, increase their amount proportionally, and recalculate the toxicity. And as the glyphosate toxicity was this little red line like this, and you replace that with something 10 times the amount, the data would shoot up.
And I think that is a plausible scenario. So for those streaming, the question is, what would happen if glyphosate never came on? Because glyphosate has displaced something, presumably. And so if we take glyphosate out, we're going to use something. Would that increase or decrease toxicity? And I think one plausible scenario is, yes, the toxicity would have shot up, especially if you're using compounds that are more or less safe than the glyphosate. But I don't think there's a good uniform answer to that, because what is replaced if glyphosate were removed? Again, there you start dealing with all those other questions. It depends on what region you're in and what weed species they have. So if you're replacing it with a highly toxic compound, then absolutely. But although glyphosate has a reputation for being extremely safe, there's actually a lot of other herbicides that are also extremely safe. And so if you replace glyphosate with, say, an ALS inhibitor, I would expect really no difference, no change. If you replace glyphosate with some of the photosystem 2 inhibitors that have a fairly rough chronic toxicity profile, then yes, it would skyrocket. So it's an interesting question, and there are people who have analyzed similar data to this, who have made some assumptions to try and get at that. I have avoided it explicitly because what you find depends on the assumptions you make. Because we don't have a real world comparison where some people adopted and some people didn't, the results of that thought experiment are going to depend on what you think, right? And so I think a case could be made either way, that it stays relatively stable. I think you could even make an argument that it would go down. But I would tend to agree with you. The most likely scenario is toxicity would increase if glyphosate were removed or had never entered the market. But that's, again, probably influenced by my personal bias. Yes?
At the beginning of your discussion, you mentioned that the upcoming merger by Monsanto. If this occurs, will this help you with your associates in this business?
Okay, the question is, man, that's a politically loaded question. The question is, if the Monsanto and Bayer buyout goes through, will that help me and my associates in trying to develop weed management programs? I'm honestly going to say I don't know. Because at least for those two companies, Monsanto produces glyphosate and a handful of other chemistries, but they're really not a very big player outside of glyphosate in the herbicide market. And so purely from a weed control standpoint, I tend to think it's maybe not going to have a huge impact because Bayer has a huge herbicide portfolio. Monsanto's pretty small. So in terms of just the herbicide part of things, I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of change in the market on the herbicide side. Now on the seed side and the trait side and all of the other aspects, it could be a completely different story. But I've not really given a lot of thought to how that all may play out. So that's kind of my impression is, at least on the herbicide side of things, I don't think it's going to be a major change with respect to new herbicide tools.
Just one thing that I think you would have been useful to put up a slide that shows the LD50 for different herbicides, because I think you're going to find that glyphosate has a very high value, and there may be some other herbicides that have a high value as well, because that would affect your toxicity. But for the chronic one, I don't know null, but the same thing would be useful. So that's one thing. The other one is that if you look at herbicide resistance, I mean, we really, as weed scientists, we would be recommending integrated weed control. And so if you were in countries that are not quite as dependent on herbicides, things like rotations, cover crops, cultivation, and even hand weeding. There are very few weeds in this world that are resistant to hand weeding.
Just a few.
So I think this is also an important point to make. So.
Absolutely, and you know, here I was focusing heavily on herbicides, but I'm on record many times over the years saying that herbicide resistance, superweeds, is a problem that we can't solve with herbicides. I mean, we've got to get our focus back on, you know, developing integrated management that uses herbicides as one tool of many and really exploiting as much as we can. And in fact, if you look at my research program, you know, herbicides are a necessary part of what I do, but the most interesting research we're doing has nothing to do with herbicides. I mean, it's crop weed competition, how weeds respond to crops and vice versa, seed bank dynamics of various weeds. And I think we really need to focus more on that if we're going to find integrated solutions. We're way behind the entomologists on a lot of resistance-related questions in integrated management.
Now we have a new generation of herbicide-resistant plants, like I guess dicamba and Liberty. How those herbicides compare to glyphosate in terms of toxicity?
Okay, so we have a new generation of herbicides that are going to be showing up soon. The 2,4-D resistant crops, the dicamba resistant crops, some others here and there in the development pipeline. How do they compare with glyphosate? When it comes to weed control, glyphosate is a remarkably unique chemistry. Its combination of relative safety but yet effectiveness for weed control is really not comparable to anything else. So any other herbicide from a weed control standpoint is a step down from glyphosate. That said, there are certain weeds and certain problems that 2,4-D and dicamba and a lot of the other chemistries are extremely effective on. When it comes to the relative toxicity, those two particular herbicides are a little bit more toxic, but still have a fairly long history of relatively safe use. So I think it's again, one of those complex questions. You know, my personal feeling is I want as many tools to manage weeds as I can get. So I think it will be nice having the option to have a 2,4-D resistant crop and a dicamba resistant crop and a glyphosate resistant crop and a glufosinate. Because what the new traits allow us to do is it allows us to choose a herbicide based on which weeds we have in the field rather than exclusively on which crop we're growing. And so and that allows me to be a better weed manager if I have, you know, all of these herbicide tools on the table as potential options, as compared to now where if I grow certain crops, there's a huge number of herbicides that are now not available. So for broadleaf weed control, 2,4-D and dicamba are excellent options in terms of efficacy. They're a little bit higher in toxicity, but again, everything here is relative. You know, EPA doesn't re-register products if we can't use them safely. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. All of the differences I showed are relative differences. all of the herbicides on that, except the ones that have been phased out due to problems, have fairly long histories of safe use over time. Yes?
You mentioned that the data used did not segregate GMO crops from non-GMO crops. How important was this, and how do you think it was able to also actually lead to the results that came out?
Well, so the data doesn't separate GMO from non-GMO, and I think that's an important point, that these are trends, and that's why I thought it was really important to include the wheat and the rice, because I think a lot of the trends we see for just increased use of herbicide modes of action over time, I think it's pretty sound to conclude at this point that that's not purely driven by adoption of Roundup Ready crops, because we're seeing the exact same increase in herbicide use in wheat, which doesn't have a Roundup Ready version, and in rice, which doesn't have a Roundup Ready version. And so I think that approach has allowed us to probably zero in on which trends are probably driven by a Roundup Ready adoption, and which trends are just kind of general market trends that are kind of tangential to the adoption. So it depends on which question you ask as to whether you need that separation. Granted, it would be great if we could look specifically at that, but again, there's a lot of people who have tried to do that, and what I've learned is their results depend on their assumptions. And so I've tried to do this with no assumptions and just looking directly at the data. Yes, you have had your hand up for a while.
I was trying to find out the reason why some of the decrease in some of these herbicides. Would it not be maybe because of reclassification in the various classes, maybe like from maybe class 2 to class 3, based on that? Because in Netherlands, I know that atrazine has been banned because of some new evidence that has come out that is very toxic to the environment.
Okay, so some of the changes in herbicide use, could that have been related more to reclassification of the herbicide rather than phasing out? And for this data, no. Because I put, so those classes that were used in the diversity analysis, I coded by whatever the current class is. So even if there were reclassifications over time, which for most of the herbicides in this data set there haven't been, but when they show up in this analysis, that herbicide is always the same. And in the US, atrazine still is a registered and widely used herbicide. So I do know there are some areas of the world that have phased it out or are in the process of phasing it out. But in the United States, which is where these data all come from, atrazine is still a very commonly used registered pesticide for use in corn.
Why are we seeing an increase in herbicide use in the US? Because I doubt if you're going from hand weeding to herbicide use. So what is behind this increase?
So what is behind the increase in herbicide use in the US? That is a complex question for which I have no data, so I want to just throw it out there that this is pure speculation. I think the reason we're seeing that increase in general herbicide use is a combination of factors. I think we've seen a reduction in tillage for weed control in the US. If you remove tillage, you have to do something else to control the weeds. That's probably going to be herbicides. So I think, especially for a lot of these crops that are grown commonly in reduced tillage, no-till systems, that explains at least some of the increase in herbicide use. I think just the fact that there's been additional herbicide development and herbicide registration, growers have more options for herbicides now than they did 20 years ago. They don't have new modes of action, but they may have this new herbicide that has been a corn herbicide for a long time that now, 5 years ago, they registered in wheat. So they have a new option in that crop to use. So I think just new herbicide development explains at least part of it.
That would lead to a replacement, not an increase.
Not necessarily, because what you'll often see is a lot of the new herbicide products that are being marketed, they're not new active ingredients or new chemistries, they're mixtures of other products. So a grower, from his perspective, may apply one herbicide, but it may have 3 different herbicide modes of action in it. So especially if you look at the wheat, barley, corn market, you can buy one jug of herbicide and it'll have a synthetic auxin group 4 herbicide, an ALS inhibitor group 2 herbicide, glyphosate, a group 9 herbicide, and a group 15 very long chain fatty acid inhibitor. So I mean, you can buy a single jug that has 4 products in it, and I think those mixture products are actually far more common than they used to be 10, 20 years ago. And so I think that explains at least part of it as well.
These mixtures, are they all employed at the full rate?
It
Or
depends.
do they bring the rate of each one down?
So when you have the mixtures are applied at the full rate, it depends. Those of us in the university side of things have been harping on our industry colleagues for many, many years to not reduce the rate because if you reduce the rate of one of those products, it's not giving you very good control of the weed on its own. If a particular product is not giving good weed control on its own, it's not doing anything for you when it comes to resistance management. And so it depends. So some companies, and I'm not going to name names today, some companies have been very good at keeping those rates at the recommended biologically effective dose. Some have not. And so it really depends on that. So for this analysis, if they cut the rate in half, it only shows up in those figures as half of an acre treatment. And so to some extent, that cutting of rates is adjusted for in the analysis I showed. But yeah, some of those combination products have many modes of action, only some of which are actually giving us much benefit in terms of herbicide diversity. So do I have advice for someone wanting to replicate this for another country? I do. Find good data, and that's challenging. So we're lucky in the US, we've got a great herbicide use database. They've actually been suffering from a lack of funding over the last 15 years or so, and so they don't do every crop every year anymore. But I do know I think the FAO actually has some similar types of data for certain countries. And so I think that would be one area to try and look to hunt down this data. It's actually kind of the opposite. The US data is actually really solid in that same database, but it just stops at 2007. So I don't know who stopped reporting it, but for certain countries, there actually are data sets that allow you to do that. And yeah, the analysis that I did here is just complete junk if you don't trust the data going in. And so there are also commercial data sets out there that allow you to do similar things, but most of the time they wouldn't let you report it the way I have because those data sets are proprietary. They consider that confidential business information that helps them market products and they can sell it to their customers. So for a lot of the things that I've done here, you have to have a public data set to actually report the way that I've reported here. But yeah, finding good data is the key.
Yeah, I want to know, how do you see the IARC's classification of glyphosate as a probable cause of cancer? From your research of the acute and chronic toxicity, can we say that actually such classification doesn't stand?
Okay, so the IARC classification of glyphosate as a possible or probable, I don't even remember what the wording they used is now, carcinogen. I actually wrote a blog post about it that I think is a little bit probably better at describing it than I will be in a short time here. I think it's quite possible that a particular chemical can be a possible carcinogen or even a likely carcinogen, while at the same time being extremely unlikely to actually cause cancer in the real world. And so that's kind of my feeling on the IARC classification of a lot of chemicals, because coffee is on their list of potential carcinogens, right? I've been drinking coffee all day. So it's very unlikely, even though it's a known potential carcinogen, it's very unlikely that it's going to cause cancer because we just can't consume quite enough of it over time. So there's a lot of chemicals on the IARC classification where that's the case. And so I personally, after having looked at a lot of the health-related data related to glyphosate, I don't agree with their assessment because if you look at the studies that are out there in humans, the evidence is extremely weak for a link to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the best done studies. In fact, in the best study, the Agricultural Health Survey, there's actually absolutely no correlation between glyphosate use and the most commonly reported cancer that it's associated, which is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So if you do a Google search of my name and glyphosate cancer, you'll bring up a lot of the data that I actually dug through and can read a little bit more about that, which will do far better justice than my little spiel right now.
You say it is the ecological impact of no-till practices, because they have been increasing lately.
So the ecological impact of no-till, that's a tough question. Because again, it depends on how much credit you want to give GMOs and Roundup Ready for adoption of no-till on one hand. I think there's pretty solid data out there that shows that growers who are using glyphosate-resistant crops are more likely to adopt no-till. But not nearly at the rate that I think a lot of people want to give it credit for. So it certainly will drive some adoption of no-till, but there's also some people who adopt no-till who then are much more likely to adopt GMO crops because they fit together well, but it's really hard to know exactly how much one is causing the other. So yes, there are certainly benefits of adoption of no-till practices which are associated with this. Reduced greenhouse emissions, improved soil structure and biodiversity, reduced soil erosion are the main ones. But that's another thing that we could probably do in a lot of crops without this technology, but it certainly helps in some others.
We are way over time, I'm realizing.
Indeed.
So you clearly have inspired some good questions. So